Vicious billionaire mocks a homeless veteran. The truth about him leaves the world in shock. Henry Calloway stood outside his luxury apartment building, the city stretching out before him like a glittering sea of gold. The morning sun bounced off the sleek glass skyscrapers, reflecting the wealth he had carefully built over decades. He was dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than most people's annual salary. His smile was cold, calculating, designed for success, designed to make those around him feel inferior. He had earned his place in the world, and he knew it. Everyone around him knew it too. As he walked down the street, surrounded by his usual entourage of assistants and high-powered business partners, Henry surveyed the crowds of people. The homeless, the working class, the ordinary citizens who made up the city's backbone, they were nothing more than background noise to him. He'd grown used to ignoring them, brushing past their tired eyes and broken spirits without a second thought. They were irrelevant, inconsequential. That's when he saw him. A man sitting on the sidewalk, wrapped in tattered clothes, his face hidden beneath a grimy beanie. His eyes were tired, weary, but there was something in them, a fire, a flicker of strength that caught Henry's attention. Henry smirked. The man didn't look like he had a care in the world. He probably hadn't bathed in days. His clothes were in tatters, his shoes falling apart. Henry paused in front of the man, his entourage slowing behind him. "Hey, old man," Henry called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Got any change for a guy like me? Maybe you could use a job. Oh wait, you don't even have a place to stay." The homeless man didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, looking up at Henry with dull, sad eyes. Henry leaned in closer, enjoying the power of the moment. His laugh echoed in the open street, sending a few bystanders glancing over. "Tell you what," Henry continued, his smile widening. "I bet you don't even know what it's like to own a car, do you? Or have a meal without begging for it. What's it like to be nothing?" The man's eyes flickered for a moment, but he said nothing. He simply looked at Henry, as if seeing right through him. The brief silence between them only seemed to intensify Henry's pleasure. He thrived on this power, knowing that he could mock anyone, humiliate anyone, and there was nothing they could do about it. Henry chuckled and stood up straight, brushing off his jacket. "I guess you'll never know," he said, turning to walk away. As he did, a slight movement from the homeless man caught his attention. The man shifted, pulling something out from under his layers of ragged clothes. For a moment, Henry wondered if the man was going to make some kind of attack, try to punch him, maybe. But no. The homeless man simply held up a crumpled piece of paper. Henry stopped and glanced back. "What's this?" he asked, irritation creeping into his voice. The homeless man didn't speak. Instead, he handed the paper over to Henry, who took it out of curiosity, though he had no real interest in what it said. It was a simple piece of notebook paper, with a single sentence scrawled on it in faded ink: "You owe me more than you think." Henry froze. His mind raced. What did this mean? Was it some kind of joke? He glanced back at the homeless man, whose eyes were now filled with something deeper. Something Henry couldn't quite place. The man simply nodded, as if to say, "It's true." Henry's grip tightened around the paper. This was absurd. He had nothing to do with this man, nothing at all. He tossed the paper aside, dismissing it as nonsense. "Get a life," he muttered, striding away, but his mind couldn't let go of the brief encounter. There was something about the man that felt familiar. As he entered the back seat of his luxury car, he tried to shake the feeling off. His assistant, standing by the door, handed him a folder filled with the day's meetings. Henry threw it aside and leaned back in the seat, staring out the window. He couldn't focus on the tasks ahead of him. For some reason, that man, Jack, kept occupying his thoughts. The audacity of it. The nerve to hand him that note. Who was that guy? Henry muttered under his breath. His assistant looked at him for a moment, unsure. "Just another homeless man, sir," she said carefully. Henry waved her off. "It doesn't matter. Let's just get to the office." But as the car sped down the street, the unease lingered. It was just a homeless man, wasn't it? Just someone who had nothing left. But the words on that crumpled paper, "You owe me more than you think." The voice of the man, calm but steady, reverberated in Henry's mind. As they arrived at his office, Henry pushed the encounter out of his mind. There were deals to be made, power to consolidate, and enemies to crush. Nothing else mattered. But deep down, a small seed of curiosity had been planted. Who was that man? Why had he said those words? For now, Henry decided it was something he would ignore. But the seed had been sown, and soon, it would sprout into something he couldn't control. Henry Calloway's day passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and the constant churn of his empire. He had learned to ignore the people who stood in his way, to dismiss their petty problems and move forward with cold, calculated precision. But as the day went on, the encounter with Jack lingered in his mind, like a faint echo he couldn't shake. Despite his best efforts, his thoughts kept drifting back to the homeless man sitting on the street corner. The old, weathered eyes. The strange calm. The note. Every time he tried to push the thoughts away, they returned, creeping up from the recesses of his mind. That night, after his meetings wrapped up, Henry sat in his office, staring out at the city below. The skyscrapers looked almost alien in their pristine glass facades, cold, polished, artificial. They represented everything he had built, and yet, tonight, they felt hollow. The soft hum of the city outside seemed so distant, so detached from the world he inhabited. The past had always been something Henry had controlled, something he'd left behind, something he'd built on to shape the future. But there was something about Jack, something in his eyes, that made Henry question the world he had constructed. What had Jack meant when he said, "You owe me more than you think"? The words gnawed at him, demanding an answer. "Sir?" His assistant's voice brought him back to the present. "We've got some documents you need to sign." Henry shook his head, clearing his thoughts. "Leave them on the desk. I'll take care of them later." The assistant hesitated for a moment, but then left the room. Henry stared at the skyline again, this time feeling a growing unease in his chest. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Something about that brief interaction had unlocked a door, and now, it felt like something inside of him was pushing to escape. The next morning, Henry decided to take a different route to his office. He had always taken the same path, past the gleaming towers and the manicured streets. But today, something compelled him to veer off the usual route. He found himself walking through a less affluent part of town, one where the city's underbelly revealed itself in full. As he turned the corner, his eyes scanned the familiar faces of the homeless. The forgotten ones. People who lived in the shadows of his world, out of sight, out of mind. It was a place where people like Jack existed, faded, invisible to those who had everything. And then, there he was again. Jack. Sitting on the same street corner, just like the day before. But today, he wasn't looking up at Henry with that distant, almost indifferent gaze. This time, Jack's eyes were focused, intent. It was as if he had been waiting for Henry. Henry's footsteps slowed as he approached, his heart beating faster than it should have. He hadn't planned on this. He hadn't wanted this. Yet here he was, drawn into the gravity of Jack's presence once again. Jack didn't speak at first. He simply sat there, his back slightly hunched, his face withered by time. There was a quiet dignity to him, despite the rags, the unkempt beard, the layers of dirt. He didn't need to say anything, his presence was enough to command attention. It made Henry uneasy. Back again? Henry finally spoke, his voice sounding colder than he intended. Jack looked up at him slowly, his eyes piercing through Henry's carefully constructed persona. "You came looking for me," Jack said, his voice low and gravelly, as though it had been years since he last spoke. Henry felt a twinge of irritation. He had expected more mockery, more distance. But Jack's words cut through the arrogance that Henry had spent a lifetime building. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. "I didn't come looking for you," Henry shot back, trying to mask the unease that was growing inside him. "But I'm here now, and I'm done with your little games." Jack didn't flinch. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. The edges were worn, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. It was of a younger Henry, no suit, no polished arrogance, just a boy, perhaps no older than 10, standing next to a man in uniform. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the photograph. The man beside him, with a strong jawline and a military uniform, was someone Henry had only heard about in stories, his father. The man who had built the empire Henry inherited. Jack didn't say a word as he handed the photograph to Henry. His expression remained unchanged. Henry's hand trembled slightly as he took the picture, the weight of it settling in his palm like a stone. "What is this?" Henry asked, though he already knew the answer. Jack's voice was steady, calm. "You owe me more than you think, Henry. Your father, he never forgot what I did for him. And neither should you." Henry stared at the photograph, his grip tightening as memories he had long buried began to resurface. The image was so simple, just a man in uniform and a child, but the weight of it felt unbearable. He could almost hear the voice of his father, booming with authority, demanding respect, telling stories of his military past with a pride that bordered on arrogance. He had always told Henry that nothing came without sacrifice, that the world owed him something for the work he had done. But now, here was Jack, with this photograph, and something in the back of Henry's mind began to click. Jack's gaze never wavered. He watched Henry carefully, as if expecting this reaction, as if he knew exactly what this moment would do to him. "Where did you get this?" Henry's voice was almost a whisper, as though he didn't want to believe the connection Jack was suggesting. Jack simply shook his head, his face still shadowed by years of hardship. "Does it really matter?" he asked softly. "The question isn't where I got it, it's what you're going to do with it." Henry's pulse quickened. He looked back at the photograph, the picture of his younger self standing beside someone he now realized wasn't just a soldier, but a man who owed his life to Jack. He swallowed hard, trying to process what this meant. The image before him told a story Henry had never known, a story buried under years of family pride and lies. His father had always been the hero in Henry's eyes. The man who built the empire, who worked his way to the top, who demanded perfection from everyone around him. Henry had spent his entire life trying to live up to that image. But now, Jack was telling him something different. "You're telling me my father knew you?" Henry's words were laced with disbelief. "What exactly are you implying, Jack?" "I'm implying that I saved your father's life," Jack replied, his voice steady, without the faintest trace of emotion. "Back in Nam. He was part of a rescue mission, and I pulled him out of a firefight. He owed me his life." Henry's mind reeled. This couldn't be true. His father never mentioned Jack. The man he had always known was an unyielding patriarch, a hero to everyone, a man who had built an empire with blood and sweat. "Don't believe me if you don't want to," Jack continued, his voice still low, but firm. "But it's the truth. Your father was indebted to me. And I never asked for anything in return. But now I'm here, and I'm asking for something." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle between them. Henry felt the ground beneath him shift, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. For years, he had lived his life believing in the simple narrative his father had fed him, that life was about power, wealth, and control. But now, faced with Jack's quiet dignity and the undeniable truth in his eyes, that narrative was falling apart. "I don't owe you anything," Henry snapped, his usual arrogance flaring up in an attempt to shield himself from the truth. "That was my father's problem, not mine." Jack's eyes hardened, but his tone remained calm. "You think it's just about money, don't you, Henry? You think that because you've built all this," he waved a hand at the city skyline in the distance, "that it somehow absolves you. But you're wrong." Henry opened his mouth to argue, but Jack cut him off before he could speak. "Let me remind you, the people who helped you, who helped your father, don't just vanish because you forget them. They stay. They're still here. And now it's time for you to make good on that debt. Henry felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was confusion. A sense of guilt he didn't know how to process. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of Jack's story with the man his father had always been. He thought back to his childhood, his father's constant promises of hard work, ambition, and survival. He had never questioned those teachings, believing they were the foundation of everything he had built. But now, in this moment, with the weight of Jack's words pressing against him, the foundation seemed fragile, cracked. "Why come to me?" Henry finally asked, his voice more vulnerable than he intended. "Why now, after all these years?" Jack's expression softened slightly, as if he were seeing Henry for the first time. "Because you're the one who can change things. You're the one who can fix the mess your father left behind." The mess he never acknowledged. He looked directly at Henry, his voice calm but unwavering. "You can do better than this, Henry. I'm giving you the chance to prove it." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the implications of Jack's words. Henry felt as though his entire worldview had been upended. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was suddenly in question. His father's legacy, his wealth, his arrogance, it was all slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "What do you want from me?" Jack's answer was simple, yet profound. "I want you to remember. I want you to remember who helped you, who sacrificed for you. I want you to give back, before it's too late." Henry's mind was spinning, and it felt as though the world around him was losing its focus. The sharp outlines of the city skyline blurred as Jack's words echoed in his head. He was caught between disbelief and something else, something much harder to face. Jack's calm presence was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding inside Henry. There was no anger in Jack's voice, no demand for retribution, just a quiet, firm insistence that Henry owed him something. The problem was, Henry had never seen the world in these terms. The idea of owing someone, especially someone like Jack, was foreign to him. His whole life had been defined by control, by the power to dictate who owed what. But now, it seemed that control was slipping away, like sand running through his fingers. His mind drifted back to the photograph, his younger self, innocent and unaware of the debt his father had left behind. And now, this man, this homeless veteran, was demanding something Henry didn't know how to give. Henry's eyes darted around, as if searching for something to hold onto. But all he saw was the cold, indifferent world around him, the world that had shaped him into the man he was. A world that didn't care about the past, about debts or sacrifices. A world that only cared about power and wealth. It was all slipping through his grasp, and it terrified him. "Why should I believe you?" Henry finally asked, his voice strained. "Why should I trust you?" Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even look angry. Instead, he simply stood up, slowly, his movements deliberate. He stepped closer to Henry, who was still seated, almost as though Jack was trying to close the emotional distance between them. "Trust doesn't matter, Henry," Jack said quietly. "What matters is that you know the truth. And once you know the truth, you can't just forget it. Not unless you want to live the rest of your life pretending it never happened." Henry stood up, his mind racing. He felt like he was being pulled in two directions. One part of him wanted to walk away, to shut Jack out and ignore the feelings of guilt that were beginning to creep in. The other part of him felt like Jack had opened something inside of him that couldn't be closed again. This truth, whatever it was, had the power to change everything. But Henry didn't know what that change would look like. "Why didn't you ask my father for anything before?" Henry asked, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "Why wait until now? After all these years?" Jack paused, looking at Henry with a mixture of pity and resolve. "Because your father wasn't the man you think he was. And he wasn't the man he wanted you to believe he was. He was a soldier, Henry. He owed debts to men like me, men he never repaid. I didn't want his money. I didn't need anything from him. But now, I need you to understand the price of his silence. The price of his pride. Henry's chest tightened at the mention of his father's pride. That was something Henry had inherited. The pride that said you never asked for help, never show weakness, and always stay in control. His father had lived and died by that code, and it had been passed down to Henry. Now, standing in front of Jack, Henry could see the cracks in that code. His father's pride had come at a cost. And now, it was Henry's turn to face it. I don't understand, Henry whispered, the weight of the situation pressing on him. What do you want from me, Jack? I don't even know you. I don't know what you want me to do. Jack's gaze softened, but his voice remained steady. I don't want anything from you, Henry. Not really. What I want is for you to see the truth. For you to know what your father couldn't or wouldn't tell you. And for you to make a choice. You can either honor the debt he left behind, or you can let it go and watch the consequences unfold. You're in control now, Henry. It's your choice. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Henry's thoughts churned, racing in every direction. He wanted to scream, to deny it all, to ignore Jack's calm certainty and walk away from the responsibility Jack was thrusting onto him. But there was no escaping it. The truth had already been laid out before him, and it was up to him to decide what to do with it. Henry opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, Jack turned to leave. There was no grand statement, no dramatic conclusion. Just a quiet exit. As he walked away, Henry felt a pang of regret, but also something else, something unfamiliar. Fear? Guilt? Or was it a flicker of understanding? He wasn't sure, but the weight of Jack's words hung over him like a dark cloud. Jack didn't look back. He simply walked down the street, his figure slowly blending into the crowd, becoming just another face in the sea of people. Henry stood there for a long time, staring at the space where Jack had been, the photograph still clenched in his hand. The world around him felt like it had shifted, its edges no longer as sharp, no longer as clear. He could hear the sounds of the city, but they seemed distant, muffled by the noise in his head. What would he do? How could he face the reality of his father's legacy, the debt that had been left to him? And what did it mean for his own life, for the empire he had worked so hard to build? The answers weren't clear yet. But one thing was certain, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Jack had given him the truth, and now, Henry had to choose how to move forward. The weight of that choice pressed down on him, and he knew that no matter what he decided, everything in his world would change. The following days were a blur of meetings and phone calls, but Henry couldn't focus on any of it. Every decision he made, every contract he signed, felt hollow. Jack's words echoed in his mind relentlessly. His father's legacy, once a source of immense pride, had become a weight he could no longer ignore. The empire he had worked so hard to build now seemed meaningless in the face of the truth Jack had revealed. The photograph, the debt, and the undeniable bond between his father and Jack, everything was unraveling. Henry found himself walking back to the street where he had last seen Jack. The cold wind bit at his skin, but it didn't matter. He needed answers. He needed to face the truth. As he turned the corner, he saw him again, Jack, sitting in the same spot as before. This time, there was no mockery, no challenge in Henry's steps. Just a quiet resolve. Jack looked up as Henry approached, his eyes unreadable, as calm as ever. He didn't speak at first, and Henry didn't either. They stood there for a long moment, the weight of their pasts hanging between them. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice steady, but his eyes filled with something he had never allowed himself to feel before. I know what I have to do, he said, holding the photograph up to Jack. I can't change the past, but I can honor it. Jack's eyes softened, just for a moment, before he nodded. That's all anyone can ask for. Henry reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He handed it to Jack, who took it without hesitation. Inside was a check, a large one. More than enough to help him start a new life, to erase the years of struggle and abandonment. But it wasn't just money. It was Henry's acknowledgement, his acceptance of the debt owed. Jack didn't immediately look at the check. Instead, he folded the envelope and slipped it into his pocket. "You don't need to do this, Henry," he said quietly. "This isn't about money. It's about remembering who we are, who helped us along the way." Henry took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle inside him. He had taken the first step toward redemption, toward righting the wrongs of his father's past. But it wasn't going to be easy. He would have to live with the consequences of his actions, and it would take time to rebuild the trust he had lost in himself. As he turned to walk away, Henry felt a sense of peace wash over him. The burden wasn't completely lifted, but it was no longer crushing him. Jack had shown him that sometimes, the hardest part of redemption was simply acknowledging the truth. And for the first time in a long while, Henry felt like he could face the world again. The journey ahead would be long, but at least it was his to take.